Much, Harry. Thank you very much for the organizers of this conference. We really need this kind of communication during this difficult times of isolation and restriction of all kind of travels. It would be a great pleasure to see all of you together in one room, but still the virtual platform gives us this sense of contact and communication and exchange of ideas. I'm very grateful for you, to you for that, and especially grateful to Tina, which always initiates this kind of very interesting gatherings. And I appreciate the chance of speaking about Tbilisi and Georgian experience, Georgian Soviet experience, which is so close to me, Tina and me, but on the other hand, which may not be that familiar to most of you. At least I see Alexis here, who has experienced the spirit of Tbilisi a couple of years ago. I hope that he will recognize some images as well as some kind of details about Georgian acceptance of reality. I would say that in our experience, Soviet 7 decades of the Soviet rule left very deep traces and very painful traces. So now we will speak about spatial representation of Tbilisi in the works of Georgian modernists. Let me share my PowerPoint, please. So the title of my paper is Spatial Representation of Tbilisi in Georgian Poetry of the 1930s, Georgian Modernism and Soviet Narrative of Modernization. Although at this conference, the urban imagination of big European cities occupied by the Nazi regime is the main topic, I would suggest to explore the formation of urban imagination and spatial representation in another city in the same time period of the 1930s. This is an alternative but similar story of the city occupied by another totalitarian regime. In this case, the city is Tbilisi, and the regime is the Soviet Russian communism, which has, of course, many similarities to German Nazi regime, and since both shared the totalitarian approach to power and the goal of controlling all aspects of the society. We start our story not from the 1930s, but still from the end of 1910s, from the late 1910s. This is the point when Tbilisi is not only a capital of a free Georgian Democratic Republic, but also is announced as a city of poets. Let's see what Georgian modernist writer Grigol Rubakidze, who had to go to exile to Germany and later to Switzerland already in 1930, still continued to reflect on Tbilisi experience and Tbilisi reality. But before that, in the late 20s, he started to reflect on Tbilisi of 1910s, saying that this was the time when the city was claimed by poets and announced as a city of poets. In the one of the artistic cafes, Cafe Internazionali in Georgian, the Georgian and international community of poets, which were in Tbilisi at that time, escaping from Russian Bolshevik Revolution and civil war, they announced Tbilisi as a city of poets, saying that the pure poetry can be performed and produced only in Tbilisi. Georgian Grigol Rubakidze recalls on his fellow poet Paulo Iashvili, who tried to conquer Tbilisi like Arthur Rimbaud tried to conquer and succeeded in conquering Paris earlier. So But Grigol Robakidze continues to reflect that at that time, conquering Tbilisi through Bohemian poetry was even more difficult than conquering Paris. And Titian Dabidze, another important Georgian poet and fellow writer of Grigol Robakidze's, here on this picture you can see these poets. This is Titian Baloyashvili, and this is Titian Dabidze. Tina, please, can you tell me if if the slides are, if you can see the slides of the PowerPoint file which I'm sharing, is it
yes.
accessible to? This is accessible. So because no,
but till now it was accessible. Yes, it's accessible.
Now it's accessible. Okay, very good. So on this picture, you can see the poets which had developed a very important cultural experience in Georgia and managed to modernize Georgian poetry through bringing the values and aestheticism of of European modernism. The group was called the Blue Horns. They demonstrated they consistently supported their decision of modernizing Georgian literature through going to the roots of modernism and implementing the symbolist principles in their works. So very sorry, Tina, again, can you tell me what can you see shared now on the screen? Is it pictures or is it a Word file? Is it PowerPoint file or Word file? Okay, so very sorry because I cannot see shared content on my screen. Anyway, well, let's hope that you can follow the images. Thanks to a very strong group spirit which Blue Horse developed, they published numerous literary works and played a very active role in changing the cultural atmosphere in Georgia. For a decade, their poetry and prose works, essays and translations stayed loyal to symbolist aesthetics and worldview. They never developed a truly avant-garde literature. However, this never became a barrier for them in their artistic cooperation with the artistic vanguard in Georgia. The Blue Horns were highly committed to their cultural and social role, and thus created an atmosphere of aesthetical dialogue and understanding between the high modernist discourse they were pursuing and the radical avant-garde experimentations practiced by others. The open and vivid cultural environment in Tbilisi, at that time the city was called Tiflis, and this is the version which is still preserved in German, modern German, but now the city is called Tbilisi. This open and vivid cultural environment created in Tbilisi contrasted with the dramatic historical processes that were going on in Russia at that time. The city, which for the centuries had been a cultural and political center of the Caucasus region, became a hub for artists fleeing the Russian cities rocked by the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917 and the subsequent civil war in 1917-1922. Tbilisi, traditionally a cosmopolitan city, was attracting young poets and artists with different ethnic backgrounds, including some natives of Tbilisi who had studied at Russian universities. I would say that the Blue Horners, Georgian symbolist poets, which I mentioned before, the Baloyashvili, Titian Dabidze, and others, were not themselves the natives of Tbilisi. They belonged to another Georgian city, Kutaisi, which was the capital of Western Georgia, more mono-ethnic and monocultural Georgian city, while Tbilisi was traditionally from the early medieval centuries the cosmopolitan city. It was founded in the 5th century Anno Domini 5th century, although we have some older cities in Georgia, and Kutaisi is at least 10th century older. It was Tbilisi which became the center and vivid place for Georgians, as well as numerous people coming from the eastern countries, as well as later from western countries, since the city developed its role on the crossroads of European and Asian, Eastern and Western civilizations, and this was also the city on the crossroad of the Silk Road. So this was the spirit of the city and the lifestyle of the city, which was still preserved in the early 20th century. In 1918, Blue Horners moved from Kutaisi to Tbilisi, and what they saw here and what seemed to be so exotic to them was the eastern or oriental part of the city, and its full market squares, the market squares full of people of various ethnicities, as well as various from various countries. Let me show you first how the image of the city is recreated in the works by one of very important Georgian modernist artists, the painter Eleni Akhmediani. So here you can see the medieval oriental part of the city, which is very unique by means of the landscape, as well as very vivid by means of activities going on there. So this is another more colorful image from Eleni Akhmediani's paintings. So Blue Horners, which belonged themselves to the city which did not have that kind of qualities, that kind of oriental qualities, and that kind of qualities of being the center of merchandising, they were fascinating with Tbilisi's nature, as well as, of course, Russian poets coming to Tbilisi were fascinated by Tbilisi's nature. Since I started to speak about this, let me share with you the poem by Osip Mandelstam, the great Jewish Russian poet, the Jewish poet who spent his life in Soviet Russia first and then Soviet Union, and who occasionally escaped to Tbilisi to find here a safe haven. So what Osip Mandelstam saw in Tbilisi of his times is described and depicted in this poem written in 1920, when he actually visited the city for the first time. Another visit of his happened in 1930s, but at that time Tbilisi was already modernized. So nostalgic lines of Osip Mandelstam about old Tbilisi are also translated to English by Ilia. This is one of very famous poem, quite much acclaimed in Russia as well as in Georgia. And you can you see the text on your screen, and can you follow the lines? Or
Yes,
of Hedgeweg Tiflis, I'm dreaming, and then he describes this whole oriental spirit of the city, and the chance that is given to the stranger or to natives here to be drawn in the dreamlike reality, and also to be drawn in red Kahetian wine, which is served here. You can see this in this verse of by Osip Mandelstam, which is served here, and you will start floating in wine, and you will start in the bottle, while your mind will start floating in surreal images of the city. So this is, of course, the translation itself is not that much accurate, but still you can feel the spirit of the city as modernists, including Georgian modernists, and including the multi ethnic groups of Russian modernists and avant-gardists coming to Tbilisi from Russian city. So the people who came to Tbilisi in 1918 belonged to different backgrounds. Some of them were born in Tbilisi, but from various ethnic backgrounds, including Polish brothers Ilia and Kirill Zdanevich and Yuri Degan, including Tatiana Wiczorka, which became a unique female face of Russian avant-garde and also Georgian avant-garde, since she developed her futurist poems in Tbilisi. The Russian poet Osip Mandelstam used to say that later that this small independent state, having grown on the bloodshed by others, here he was keeping in mind the bloodshed in Russian Revolution and First World War, which was of course taking his active development in those years, tried this city and this country tried to be bloodless, suppressed by ferocious powers. It aspired to enter history as a pure and successful state, to become something like a new Switzerland, a neutral piece of land, innocent from birth. So what gave Tbilisi this kind of hopes of keeping his what gave Georgia, the whole Georgia, this kind of hopes of keeping this peaceful and neutral place apart from world war or revolution and civil war, was the fact that the country was established as a free democratic republic after the dissolution of the Russian Empire, after a Bolshevik Revolution and after the end of the World War. So, but this was very short moment. I would continue with that later, but let me also show you some images of how Tbilisi and how Georgia was seen by Georgian and Russian modernists of that time. Although I showed you the eastern parts of the city, this is how actually the central part of the city looked. It was very much Europeanized already and very much modernized. And of course, the spirit of European modernism was filling the streets and also the basements and buildings of it. In the basement of this building, this is Rustaveli Theater. Till nowadays, this is the place where this very important and widely famous Georgian theater is situated. In the basement of this building, Georgian poets in cooperation with Russian avant-gardists established the artistic cafe, which was called Kimerioni, and Georgian and Russian artists, including Lado Gudiashvili, David Kakabadze, Sergei Sudeikin, which was a famous Russian modernist artist, which used to paint the walls of artistic cafes in St. Petersburg before the Russian Revolution. Now they were painting the walls of this artistic cafe in Tbilisi, but still the Eastern Asian Oriental part of Tbilisi is reflected on murals. This is the mural by Lado Gudiashvili, and this is the mural by Sergei Sudeikin. So they try to follow the images, to pursue the images which keep inspiring them. Here you can see the page from another avant-garde artistic work. This is the page from the joint book project by Alexei Kryuchonych, famous Russian futurist, and also Vasily Kaminsky, another Russian futurist, and Georgian-born Polish brothers Kirill and Ilia Zdanevich. So the graphic is developed by Kirill Zdanevich, but the content is developed by Kryuchonych and Vasily Kaminsky. And here you can see, can you see this word Tiflis in Russian, spelled here in, written here in Russian? Russian. They want to keep the connection with the topos, with the artistic milieu and with the geographic milieu of the city, and also the same group established the avant-garde grouping, which was called 41 degree. 41 degree had two connotations. This was the level of body temperature when a person loses his mind and loses the ability to express his thoughts through logical order, and he starts to be plotted in irrational verbal system. But on the other hand, 41 degrees the parallel where Tbilisi is situated. So these concrete examples may show you how the city is reflected in works by Georgian as well as Russian or Polish avant-gardists who gathered here by the end of 1910s and enjoyed the free atmosphere of Georgian Democratic Republic. Although this free atmosphere was very short-lived, and in 1921 Russian Bolsheviks annexed the city again and started to spread their power and their control upon Georgian literature and upon Georgian culture in total. But still, in the early 1920s, we can see that Georgian artists, also Russian emigres and poets and avant-gardists in exile, went back to their kin countries and country Russia, and some of them went to Paris. Although Georgian avant-gardists and poets were able to continue, at least for 5 or 6 years, their avant-garde modernist activities. Even new avant-garde grouping H2SO4 was established in Tbilisi, and here you can see how the image of Tbilisi is reflected in graphic work published in their literary journal H2SO4. We don't have much time to explore on the qualities of Georgian modernist and avant-garde further, but this is something what I wanted to share you before we switch to another reality, which is Russian-controlled reality and the life in Tbilisi, which was since then modeled after the central models developed in Soviet Russian center. This is a Stalin cultural policy. Stalin designed a new cultural policy through which the homogeneous socialist realism style was implemented all over the Soviet state. The cultural area was managed by the instruments of hidden control and, on the other hand, by floating state support for culture. Stalin introduced the policy of inclusion instead of Lenin Trotsky's exclusion of prominent modernist cultural figures into Soviet cultural integrity. The most popular and distinguished modernist authors were asked to openly declare their commitment to the Soviet state and to switch to socialist realism while receiving the highest recognition from the state in return. However, their social, cultural capital and reputation were being utilized by Soviet power. Two poets, Georgian poet Tizian Tabidze and Boris Pasternak, start to develop their new approach to the reality and develop their friendship, which lasted until Tizian Tabidze's death within the Great Purge in 1937. While Russian modernists in the Soviet center were given a chance of conversion from modernism to socialist realism, also Georgian modernists in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, this was the official status of Georgia within the Soviet, within the USSR, they also were given this similar task. So it was not the free choice, but actually actually it was the decision which was imposed to them by the Soviet power. Since the end of 1920s, it was clear to modernists that this was not a free choice. Distinguished writers or artists who successfully practiced modernism in the early decades of the 20th century were now expected to join Soviet cultural integrity, to share and propagate Soviet values and socialist realist aesthetics. At the same time, the option of conversion given to modernists was not just an expression of party's kind will. In truth, it was an important for the Soviet power itself to enlist among its supporters prominent cultural figures, thus using their social capital and making it clear to the public that Soviet project is now supported also by former modernists. That's how Tizian Tabidze and Boris Pasternak became the somehow hostages of the Soviet system, and started to reflect Georgian reality in their verses and in their works from a different angle. This was the angle suggested by the Soviet system, imposing that the main feeling and main spirit of Soviet poets should be the happiness, and they should be expressed in their works. And of course, beyond this happiness, we could see already at that time, and from now, from today's perspective, we can see their tragic fates, how they ended their lives within the Great Purge or Siberian camps. So we can fully follow their life paths from today's perspective. But now I would like to switch to my final point, the narrative of Georgia's modernization and Tbilisi's modernization, suggested by the Soviet power, by Stalin and his hangman, as English scholar of Georgian literature Donald Rayfield calls this. Stalin and his hangman, one of his major hangmen was Lavrenti Beria, which by that time was the leader of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic. And they initiated the project of modernization of Tbilisi, which was also related to the reconstruction of the city and the reconstruction of the Tbilisi river banks. Now you can see how Tbilisi river bank is depicted in 19th century graphics, and this is the photographic image of the river bank. And here you can see that there is a small island deep in the inside the river Mtquari, very similarly to the island inside the river Seine in Paris. So this was something very inspiring to Georgian poets. Famous Georgian poet Galaktion Tabidze used to develop his verses about this island, which was at that time called Madatov Island, since since Russian General Madatov bought the island, but before it belonged to Georgian aristocrats or Beliani. So these are two names of the island which could be recognized in Georgian poetry of that times, as well as this name came back to Georgian literature in post-Soviet times, when young Georgian writer Aka Morchiladze in the 1990s, started to reconstruct the reality of Tbilisi, which had been disappeared. So here you can see the works of reconstruction of this island. This was the original version. You can see the water mills on the river, which created very exotic imagery of this city. And now this is the picture of taken while the reconstruction of the river bank. So here you can see the contrastive image. This is old river bank, and this is modern river bank. There is a story that Eleni Akhmediani, the artist who used to depict Tbilisi, avant-garde artist who used to depict Tbilisi in his works. I showed you already a couple of her works. Eleni Akhmediani was begging the workers while reconstruction not to start destroying the riverbank, but still this happened. This is one visual image of Tbilisi's reconstruction, which is reflected in Georgian poetry also but from the positive perspective. Georgian poets in the 1930s were completely deprived of opportunity of expressing their critical views and or their national views. So only option for them was to have the positive acceptance of the reality, at least express. I'm running out of time, I believe, so I'm finishing in a couple of minutes, sorry. So I want to finish my presentation with a book by Georgian poet Iosif Grishashvili, which he published in 1928. The book is called The Literary Bohemia of Old Tbilisi. Iosif Grishashvili was witnessing that his favorite, this is the front cover of the book, and these are Old Tbilisi folk poets from the end of 19th century and early 20th century, which used to produce their poetry, their kind of folk poetry, very much based on Persian tradition. This was kind of alternative to European modernist wave in Georgian literature, which was, of course, mainstream. But Iosif Grishashvili wanted to show the marginal sides of Tbilisi districts, Oriental districts, and that's why he developed this very thorough study of Georgian Tbilisi traditions and lifestyle. So what we have by the end of 1930s is Tbilisi, which is already quite much similar, at least central districts are becoming much similar to Russian Moscow central model. I will show you, if I have a couple of minutes, I want to share with you a video of the 1930s done in 1937 by Georgian filmmakers. This is a chronicle documentary. Do I have a couple of minutes or not really?
If it's really a couple of minutes, it's fine.
It's really a couple of minutes. Yeah. I will try to start the video and also follow it with my comments. This is, I'm sorry, I have to share it from Facebook resource because this is the chronicle preserved in Georgian National Archive. So this is how Tbilisi is already represented in the 1930s. So the voice of narrator is accompanying this chronicle, saying that the country is the capital is developing and it's already turning into modern city. So the Soviet narrative of modernization starts to substitute the Georgian narrative of European modernization, European modernism, which was a dominant narrative in the time of pre-Georgian Democratic Republic, and also this is the narrative followed by Georgian poets and artists. So now you can see the city which is already modeled after the Soviet center, after Russia. You can recognize some Moscow architectural style now on this chronicle, and you can see that the reality is completely changed and completely developed after the central metropolitan models. And Georgian poets had to follow these models in the 30s until the major figures of Georgian modernism became the victims of Great Purge. Tizian Davide and Paolo Iashvili, whom I mentioned before, both became the victims. Tizian Davide was executed in 1937, and Boris Pasternak, a famous Russian writer and poet whom I mentioned before as Tizian Davide's close friend, didn't believe till the period of destalinisation that Tizian Davide was executed. His family was not notified about his execution, and Boris Pasternak and Tizian Davide's widow kept communicating their letters with the hope that somebody could have met Tizian Davide in one of Siberian camps. But no, he was already executed in 1937. Paolo Iashvili committed suicide in 1937 in the building of Georgian Writers' House. Nicolo Mitishvili, another Georgian symbolist poet, was also executed, as well as Shango Hohoberidze and Pavle Nozadze, Georgian futurists. So what we have by the start of the Second World War, we have completely homogenized Georgian literature, completely controlled by the Soviet power and completely placed within the frames of socialist realism, aestheticism, and Soviet ideology. And the image of Tbilisi in that works and that new works starts to be represented as a sunny Tbilisi, sunny capital of the sunny Georgia, which is full of happiness. But beyond this happiness, we can see how the Soviet modernization has abrupted the process of Georgian modernism, as well as finished the lives of Georgian modernist poets. So this is the end of my presentation. I'm very sorry if I somehow took more of your time.
Okay, thank you very much, Bela. I think it was. I mean, it is a particularly interesting case of Tbilisi as a national cultural center within the Soviet Union. And I can see that there are certain resemblances with other Soviet states, like, for example, the Baltic states, Estonia, which I know well because of my family background. And they have a similar cultural development with regard to the Soviet Union. So I have a lot of questions still, but we will keep them for after all presentations.